Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to chair a more than challenging panel on the future of EU-Russia relations after the invasion in Ukraine, with the participation of 6 distinguished speakers. Due to time constraints, there will be only one round of inputs from our panelists. So cutting to the chase, my work is a little bit to set the terrain for your presentations by trying to connect the dots between past, present, and future. So my first question would be regarding the critical role of history and geography. Let's say that we could turn back time. Could the EU or the Western Alliance apply a different strategy, a different set of policies over Russia during A, the 90s, and before the rise of Vladimir Putin to power, and B, after the Ukraine crisis in 2014. For me, these indicated time frames serve as the two sides of the same coin. Second question, going from the past to the present. Noting the current state of play, in contrast to the past, we now observe the astonishing unity of the European Union, with decisions taken at the almost highest common denominator, the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and its growing isolation, Germany's historic shift. We have thrown to the basket dozens of books. Which do you think are Putin's present objectives? Was it only about NATO, or also blocking, reversing Ukraine's European orientation? In the end of the day, is he a rational or an irrational actor? Finally, the future, the most difficult one. When it comes to post-war and the way forward in the years ahead, will Russia have another chance of revisiting its European prospects? We have studied Russia's pendulum swinging between East and West. Does the EU have an interest to encourage such a course of action? Or on the contrary, should it maximize its pressure over Russia with the hope of regime change? On top of that, what is your approach in a potential Sino-Russian heavy alliance, which amongst others would complicate US but also Europe? US strategy of identifying only China as its primary rival in the long run and place Moscow as Beijing's, with no alternatives than to become China's junior partner. These are the 3 questions. And allow me, before I give the floor to the Honorable Ambassador of Sweden, last but not least, noting the participation of the Ukrainian ambassador and recalling the words of an ardent supporter of Europe, Jacques Delors, who was teaching us that there is no future without memory. Allow me, with my dual hat, both as a Greek and as a European, to express my gratitude to the heroic peoples of Ukraine who are teaching us here in Europe a much needed crash course on patriotism, resistance, and above all, dignity. Thank you, Ambassador. The floor now goes to the Ambassador of Sweden, Johan Borgstam. The floor is yours for the next 6-7 minutes max. Thank you.
Okay, dear Sotiris, thank you very much for this invitation. You certainly put a lot of on the table to unpack. Let me also start with condolences to my dear colleague, Ambassador Sergii, for the latest Russian atrocity at the Kramatorsk railway station. Now, the question about what the EU, the broader West, could possibly have done differently. As they say, hindsight is always 20/20, and of course we could have done things differently. But let me be very clear. I find the discourse that you sometimes hear that the West is somehow indirectly to blame for the war in Ukraine. Putin was pushed into a corner, expanding the NATO to the Baltic states was somehow reckless. I find that discourse utterly pathetic. The main error, as I see it, on behalf of the West was to be for far too long too starry-eyed about the nature of the regime in the Kremlin. We watched assassinations of dissidents inside Russia, outside Russia. We watched the Russian war machine in action in Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and still the coin somehow didn't drop. We chose to believe, we chose to become ever more dependent on Russian oil and gas, and of course, this encouraged Putin. So the idea that no one could have known, no one could have imagined what was to unfold on the 24th of February, that's simply not true. And I mean, just ask any of our Eastern European friends in the European Union. I mean, they are not surprised at what took place on the 24th of February. They are not surprised at what is unfolding now. Now, when we look at Putin's so-called objectives, we have to understand that Russia's criminal war in Ukraine, it was never about whether Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO or not. For Putin, this is about the existence of the Ukrainian nation. It's about the existence of Ukraine as an independent sovereign nation. He sees an independent Ukraine, whether it's a NATO member or not, as an aberration that needs to be corrected. This has been made perfectly clear in speeches by Vladimir Putin's cronies, and in the official propaganda now being churned out in Moscow. And of course, the objectives of Putin extend far beyond Ukraine. And I think you should all ask yourselves, do you seriously believe that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would feel that they would be more secure now if they hadn't joined NATO in 2004? Then when it comes to whether he's a rational actor or not, I mean, I think he was rational in the sense that he based the decision to invade Ukraine on what he thought he knew. He thought that Ukraine would collapse like a house of cards, that the West would grudgingly move on and accept. And he thought that a minimal number of Russian servicemen would lose their lives. But, you know, the three fundamental errors of Putin here was to underestimate the will and capacity of the Ukrainian people to fight back. He underestimated the will of the West to move swiftly with sanctions and military and humanitarian support to Ukraine. And he also gravely overestimated the capacity of his own troops, because it, not surprisingly, it turned out that it's very different for Russian paratroopers to fight a foreign army and not to be used to put down civil unrest inside Russia or in Kazakhstan. So furthermore, on the topic of the supposed strategic genius of Vladimir Putin, let us now, I mean, he has now created a situation where Ukraine is more united than it has ever been. His army has been thoroughly humiliated, and you now, on top of it, you have a serious discussion in my own country, Sweden, and in Finland about joining NATO. And I think it would be the height of irony if Russia, because of this war, ends up with an additional 1,340 kilometers border with NATO when it comes to Finland. And then when it comes to, you know, Russia's European prospects, so to speak, of course they have a chance to revisit those European prospects, but that presupposes an immediate cessation of hostilities, a retreat from all occupied territories in Ukraine. It presupposes that the guilty of the war crimes that have been committed and are being committed are all prosecuted. And until that day, the sanctions will have to remain in place. They will have to be made more far-reaching, more effective. And we have to remember that the sanctions are not about forcing regime change in Moscow. The objective of the sanctions is to thwart the Russians' abilities to continue the war in Ukraine. The most important thing I would say for the European Union is that we all know that one day, one way or the other, the arms will grow, the weapons will grow silent in Ukraine. And for the European Union, it now has to be on the top of the priority list to start preparing for the reconstruction of Ukraine, both Ukraine's infrastructure, but also the institutional infrastructure of Ukraine. And some of you will have heard former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt, who is here in Delphi these days, referring to start planning for a Ukraine 2.0, and I think we should take him very seriously. When it comes to the so-called Sino-Russian partnership, I mean, we have to remember that this partnership between Russia and China is not a marriage of love. It's based on a shared sense of having been disrespected by the West. But I don't think that this will necessarily be particularly stable over time. Remember that Russia's trade with China is the equivalent of 10% of China's trade with the European Union and the United States. I find it difficult to believe that China will be willing to pay just any price to be closely associated with what more and more resembles a pariah state. And remember, finally, Russia is a very poor country. This is a country where 40% of the population do not have running water in their homes. It has a population that is 14 times the size of Sweden's, but it has a GDP that is not even 3 times the size of Sweden's GDP, a country of 10 million. So that's where we are. Thank you very much, Sotiris.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. The floor now to Ambassador Shutenko from Ukraine. You have 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the words of solidarity, and especially what happened today in Kramatorsk. But the theme of this discussion is different. And first of all, I would like to note that the whole forum in Delphi is about, I mean, at some extent touches Ukraine, and now you have the very 6-7 minutes opportunity to listen about Ukraine from the Ukrainian, which quite use this chance.
Still, there are many panels on Ukraine.
On Ukraine without Ukraine. I mean, without Ukrainian being present. But anyway. And it also pleases me that this panel is about EU-Russia relations, meaning that in this forum, we're already part of the European Union. And I believe that this good move will move into Brussels, and soon we will be a full-fledged member of the EU. I don't want to tell you about recent and events in Ukraine. You already know that very well from mass media and from other presenters. What could have done European Union? Now we have listened a lot of statements from the experts, from the security services, from others, that they had miscalculated Russia. And I believe the dramatic miscalculation was that Russia has never stopped Cold War. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the big disappointment of the Russian elite was the collapse of the Soviet Union and losing the status of superpower. So they switch on the status of smoke and mirrors and try to present themselves as being an integral part of Europe, playing with the democratic institutions, pleasing all the democracies in the world, flirting with them, engaging with them. There was a very active cooperation with NATO. There was different economic projects, but you should understand that there was a policy. If Russia were not able to compete and to conquer with the military power, they tried to play some other games, because the leaders of Russia has a KGB background, so the special operations is their thing. So they tried to bribe Europe, building Nord Stream 2 projects and telling everybody that it's purely economic and bribing the Europe with the cheap gas and oil. And because Europe was caring about well-being and economy, and it was put at the top of the European agenda, they played along. They supported this, despite all warnings, as my colleague said, about Chechnya, about Georgia, about Crimea. They're still playing and believing this economic engagement and dialogue would prevent Russia from what happened now. And I think that was a big miscalculation, because it was a big special operation on the part of Russia. And now everybody sometimes seems surprised, but if you listen to us and listen to the countries that were part of the Soviet Union or were involved in this politics, they warned you. The Baltic states, Poland, for many years. But the West lived in the peace for such a long time that they become tranquilized, appeased, and they didn't believe that the war in Europe could happen. That's what about the past. About the future, this current security situation, as it stands now, failed the European architecture, because even 2 months ago, I've heard the statement that Russia is a part of European security architecture. It's not the part. It's never been the part. That was a trick, and still people still using this and still it now. But it shows that the future, the future should be shaped by the new security architecture, and Russia should be isolated until it proves by deeds, not by words, because sanctions hurt. So they might use the tactics to say that it's a peace in Ukraine, now leave the sanctions and back to business as usual. The seeds of hatred are already planted, and as soon as Russia understands that they can't trick anymore, it won't help for Europe to be safe and secure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the floor now goes to Etka Tkeshelashvili, a variety of affiliations, former Deputy Prime Minister of Georgia, amongst others. Etka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll start with echoing perhaps what Ambassador of Sweden, His Excellency, mentioned at the beginning, that the very concept that somehow West is complicit when it comes to encouraging Russia to export aggression and suffering and atrocities in the way that we see it now is not only pathetic, but it's very dangerous for the future as well. Because at some point, as a Georgian, as a person that has lived through the end point of the Soviet Union at the point of its dissolution, experiencing that moment of hope and enthusiasm that we all had with that moment, I want to remind all of us in the room that let's just acknowledge once again that it is good that Soviet Union was dissolved, that evil empire is not anymore part of our life. Because when we speak about that, it seems to be self-obvious, but when some still refer to humiliation that Russia might feel still, or disrespect, we don't acknowledge the fact that the only reason why Russia could feel humiliated is because Russia is not recognized as an empire in a legitimate way. And if we acknowledge the fact that Russia has some reason to be humiliated, we don't acknowledge the fact that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was greatest achievement of the 20th century, liberation of so many people. So let's just start with that. It was the greatest moment of the history. So many nations that have been captive of Russian colonialism starting from the 19th century, continued with the Soviet colonialism in the 20th century. We regained the freedom. Ancient people, freedom-loving people, and Ukraine is the greatest example of that. Now, if we look into that from this perspective, what was the greatest mistake that EU did in this regard? somehow tacitly acknowledging that special status of Russia. Because if you think of it, so many of us being post-Soviet countries, as we were called for long, as if it was a common brand defining our nature as the republics, was left to be in that gray zone. So while on the one hand, EU was building, opening the door to Russia, which was in itself was a good thing to do, but opening that special relationship with Russia, much more special than to any of us, with special strategic partnership agreements, with economic agreements that have been reached with Russia, which holding twice a year strategic high-level meetings with Russia, when even with other strategic partners of Europe, it only once a year you would hold the meetings like that. And doing that continuously after 2008 invasion of Georgia, continued occupation of Georgia, after 2014 and 15 and continuation of the de facto occupation again of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine. Somehow Europe felt in that historical amnesia of some kind that was called and branded as pragmatism. And my appeal to the audience today is that, yes, we need to be pragmatic, but by that what I mean is that adherence and commitment to the values, freedom, and then principles that brought that stability and prosperity to Europe that we all cherish after the Second World War, part of it, and fundamentally, that is the result of commitment to fight for and maintain the principles and values that bind Europe together. So I guess what Ukraine did now, and then that's part of how we see and cherish now that unity that we all congratulate ourselves with when it comes to transatlantic unity and unity with the EU, is that Ukraine reminded everybody that these values still exist. And there are actually people who are ready to pay with their blood and life for those freedoms. When some in Europe still are preoccupied whether or not, as Prime Minister of Italy has said recently, whether or not conditioner will be on during the summertime. So let's be honest in our conversation. The mistake was not to disrespect Russia. Russia had a special treatment from the very beginning of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, almost indirect acknowledgement of the fact that it had some kind of a special entitlement in the neighborhood still. Look what happened in 1994 when Ukraine was forced to relinquish its nuclear arsenal and then got this paper, Bucharest Memorandum in return, guaranteeing nothing basically in regards to that. And now when we speak about the occupation and then how the future for Russia could be opened with Europe, we rightfully say that they need to withdraw troops from Ukraine. I full-heartedly support that. But it's not even remembered that Russia needs to do the same in my country, where 20% of my country is occupied. How comes that we all forget even recent history in which we all lived through? Very recently, it's just 2008 when Russia invaded, and it was the first time when Russia invaded a neighboring country openly. Paid no price to that, and because of that, we're paying the price of being where we are now, with the largest invasion in Europe and then threat to common security. I think part of what we need to realize now is that hard times are ahead of us. There will be no quick solution. There will be no quick fix to the problems that we all face. But one thing that is determinative, so to say, for us to have the chance, and for Russia in the future to have a chance, to start to be one step ahead of Russia. Let's quit catching up with Russia, reacting to what Russia does to all of us. And by the way, one of the greatest achievements Russia did, it undermined credibility of Europe for so long by eroding Europe's moral stance outside of Europe. You guys might think that you have the moral high ground, but then in the rest of the global universe, so to say, Europe is associated with corruption and kleptocracy that Russia promoted very much so. So let's close the loopholes of that malign influences. Let's regain the moral high ground. And then understand that peace and prosperity is linked with the rules-based international order, that it's not only for weak states that we are interested in international law, or the small states for that matter, but the big guys have an interest of that as well. And as Václav Havel said in 2008 back then, it's no time now for Europe to have peoples divided against their wills and against over their heads, so to say, so that they are placed against their will in the spheres of influences. And I resonate with that very strongly, not as a Georgian, but as a European in that sense. And what I want to highlight that and why in this moment when so much talk about peace talks and ceasefires and all of that is going on with Ukraine, nothing can ever be decided over the head of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Full stop.
Thank you, Eka. I just wanted to echo and maybe some commentary from our last three speakers. Although the three of you touched a lot about the 90s, nobody really talked about what may happen in different manner after 2014, especially as Eka has mentioned, with countries that have open business with their imperial past. Now the floor goes to Robert Vass, a view from Slovakia and the president of Globsec.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here in the Delphi Forum. It's my first time, but I will definitely come back many more times, and we are also starting to officially cooperate with the Delphi Forum, which I'm very grateful. I can start this with a very encouraging note that our Prime Minister is on the way to Kiev together with Ursula von der Leyen, and they are going to meet very soon, which is a strong sign of huge support from the Europe and the neighboring country, Slovakia. I'm also happy to say that we announced right now, just a few minutes ago, that we have given the S-300s to Ukraine, and they are already on the Ukraine soil. I think this is very important that we as the West are supporting the fight you are doing, because you are fighting not only for yourselves, but you are fighting for Europe. Because what Putin has done to a sovereign neighboring country of Ukraine was not only an attack on a sovereign country, it was a frontal attack on the very basic principles of European order. So that is an attack against Europe whole, free and at peace, against the very principles that are written in several documents that they even signed as well. So they don't want this kind of security architecture that is based on sovereign states, whether small or big, who can decide themselves about their policies. They want to turn back the time where the superpowers decided what the small countries can and cannot do. And if we compromise in this war, we will lose in long term. So there is no time to compromise even a centimeter, an inch of it. We thought that freedom and security is given in Europe, and this kind of war will never return on Europe. Actually, it is here. And you are paying, as Ukrainians, with your blood for what we take as guaranteed. So it is our moral obligation to help you with your fight, because if they don't stop there, they will go further to Europe. And we've seen this in the history. So where did we make mistakes? We made a lot of mistakes, not by enlarging NATO, but we made mistakes by not enlarging it enough, for example, for Georgia, etc. Because what Russia understands is a language of power. Language of power. That's what they really understand. But what I want to say here, that this is a real game changer. This war ends the so-called post-Cold War era. And this is a completely new reality of international affairs, where we will be confronted for decades in a divided world and in a confrontation. So we have to be prepared for it. And we have to be prepared for a new reality that for peace we will have to pay. And it will be costly. We will not live again in a world where we will not pay for our peace. We had unprecedented 70 years of relative peace because of NATO and EU. And Russia wants to challenge that, and we cannot give up on this. What are Putin's objectives right now, and whether he is rational or irrational? I would say he is very irrational from our standpoint of view, but very consistent. He was very consistent in long term, saying that Ukraine has no right to exist. The real provocation on Russia is the very fact of existence of Ukraine as such. And he was very consistent in that, but we as the West did not listen. We did not take him seriously, because we thought that the big talks are part of the political rhetorics. but actually he was following through that in 2008, 2014, etc. And because they did not pay a real price, they said that, okay, they underestimated the West, that we will not come up with the sanctions, that we will not be able to agree. So it was a huge underestimation. And what's happening right now and what could happen is that he's losing. We have to admit, and the fact is that Putin politically already lost. He lost everything. The reality is different as he wanted. West is united. There are sanctions. There are just few months before bankruptcy. They will be facing huge economic challenges. If we keep this unity, the internal pressure on Russia will be so big that they will have to adjust their actions. So we need to keep this unity going on, and we need to keep supporting Ukraine long term. We cannot allow to go back to normal. And because of he is losing in information war, he is losing economically, he is losing militarily, he will need to bring something home which he can present as partial win. And my fear is, and based on my discussions with Ukrainians, that his timeline is 9th of May, which is the day of the victory over fascism. And he would like to sell at least that he was able to, as he calls it, denazify the east of Ukraine, which is absolutely crazy. But he will not stop there. It's just an intermediate maybe goal. He will never stop there. So we need to keep this in mind. And the only way how he can simply, at least partially succeed, and that's the tactics he's doing, he's creating a huge humanitarian crisis. And he is trying to use this humanitarian crisis to create pressure on the Ukrainian authorities, but also on the West, to stop this war and to do a dirty deal.
Robert.
And I would like to say that we cannot allow this. We have to support Ukraine because we are in the war as well.
Thank you so much, Robert. Now the floor to a colleague from the Freie University of Berlin, Theocharis Grigoriadis. But also, I think we should remind also to the audience what Robert said about the link between economics and security. I think a good lesson for Germany. And so, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for me to be here under those circumstances. Yes, we have seen that several countries that had the bad luck to share a common history with Russia are either in a situation of underdevelopment, have lost territory, or both. Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, just to name a few. So when it comes to the responsibilities of the West, yes, I mean, we can say that the Washington Consensus reforms in the post-Soviet space were flawed, and that these reforms led to the rise of oligarchs and the collapse of government capacity. But this is not, of course, the reason, and this does not justify what we observe right now. The reason why Russia failed to integrate with the West was mainly due to its own corruption and to the inability of its own elites to adjust to the reform initiatives that were given. I mean, there is common knowledge, of course, also in the economic literature that gradualism, rather than shock therapy, produces better long-run economic outcomes. And maybe we could have acted more wisely in that respect. But this is not the main reason why we observe the things that we observe today. After Crimea, I mean, the Western policy after Crimea was also not decisive enough in giving Ukraine a clear European path. Also, the open door policy of NATO was also not, in my opinion, a very smart idea. NATO should have decided after Crimea whether it wants to admit Ukraine or not, and directly. I mean, these delays that we observed both from the side of Europeans and NATO actually left Ukraine in this situation right now to fight alone. So to come back to the future and what could happen, what can happen now. I mean, I'm not very optimistic, and I think that the scenario of a West-Russia confrontation should not be, at this point, excluded. So Putin's goal is clear. He wants to impose, he wants to annihilate Ukrainian sovereignty, and he will do that if we do not stop him. And we need to be able to take very hard decisions at this point. I mean, we observe the Syrian scenario unfolding in front of our eyes again, but with much more unforeseeable consequences. So the question is what we want to do, and we need to do it fast. We need to support Ukraine more directly. So regarding the alliance with China and Iran, China and Russia are voting the same things in the Security Council. The last 10 years at least, we observe a clear parallelism of Russian and Chinese foreign policy. It's basically like one actor. And also Iran has been under the Russian umbrella. Russia has taken opportunity of the West's inaction with respect to the nuclear program. So nevertheless, I would also say that this alliance with China in particular may exist at a political level, but at an economic level, I would not say that it has lots of perspective, because China wants to maintain its dominant status in the world economy. Putin is rational to preserve his dictatorship. He's doing all this mainly by having his domestic audience in mind. But of course, he doesn't care about the Russian economy or the Russian people. And of course, this is an attack against Europe and its values directly. Whether we can have again relations to Russia under the Putin regime, absolutely not. So Putin considers Europe, he doesn't even acknowledge the European Union. You remember the treatment of High Representative Borrell by Sergei Lavrov in Moscow. And he's not interested in a European prospect. He's interested in undermining the national sovereignties of separate European countries. And of course, with the purpose of broadly dismantling a European agenda. And yeah, so, and last but not least, I want to say that again, the Sino-Russian alliance would not be very robust. Although China has already given signals that it is willing to politically support Russia, while not so much economically.
Thank you so much, Sotiris, and providing an insight on what didn't actually happen after 2014. And our last speaker, Ronald Meinardus from Greek ELIAMEP. Ronald.
Yes, thank you. First of all, congratulations to you as a moderator to manage this in 45 minutes. I think this is a world record, and we should mention
I'm not a typical Greek on that.
With the Guinness institution. Two disclaimers. First of all, while I'm proudly associated with ELIAMEP, of course, I'm speaking on my own behalf. The second one, I'm neither a Russia or a Ukraine expert. Everybody today is an Ukraine expert, and I do not belong to these people, of course. What I'm doing, I'm sharing my personal commentary, and I think in a democracy it's useful that experts and scholars and political scientists and journalists share their expertise, and we come to some sort of a conclusion. But in the end of the day, with all due respect, of course the ambassadors have a different role, but it'll be up to the historians sometime from now to come to some definite conclusions. In the end of the day, I cannot hide that I'm a German, and I'm socialized by discourses in my own country. And Germany is going through a dramatic, a revolutionary change, a change of epoch, a Zeitenwende, as we say. And I like these three levels you're suggesting, the past, the present, and the future. And looking at the past, if I look at my personal account, I myself was politicized, was socialized in a time when the same issues were debated in Germany, how we deal with Russia, how we deal with the East. And my heroes then, those people who made me become politically an activist and then get involved, were people like Willy Brandt and Hans-Dietrich Genscher. And they stood for a very, very specific way of addressing the issue of an illiberal, undemocratic Eastern Europe. And for us, for the majority of the Germans today, this was a big success story to open up, to reach out to an autocratic and a very undemocratic situation. And the opposite model, which we had before '69, was the containment with the Hallstein Doctrine in 1957, where was the aim to isolate the East. Now, we as Germans have had great success stories, and I would agree with our friend from Georgia. This has been a magical moment that the Eastern Europe was liberated, that we had democracy and elections, but it only took so far, and it was not led to the very end. But at least we would argue that it was this opening up the détente which led to a destabilization of the communist totalitarian regimes. And we will see, and if looking ahead, and this is a perspective, now of course we all agree that there's only one issue, and that is solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And this is undisputed, and everybody should join in. But there will we will expect to see a time when the wars ended. We will have to define what that means, what the wars ended, how does that look, the end of the war. And then we will start discussing in serious, the governments will discuss in serious, how do you deal with Russia? Because Russia happens to be there, it happens to be a big country. And then I would predict, with all due respect, that we will have the same debates as we had in the 50s and the 60s, of a camp saying we have to isolate these guys and we do not have to do anything with them, and there will be another camp which would say, no, we have to reach out. And more is needed, actually, and this is also an experience we have then putting Putin aside. It's not only Putin. I'm not a Russian expert, but this is, I mean, everybody can see that there's a nomenclatura in place. And as a journalist by profession, I'm actually shocked to see that 80%, as this is according to opinion polls, seem to be supporting this gentleman, or this guy. I'll take the gentleman back. So what is needed is really a systemic change in this country, in a country called Russia. After decades of indoctrination, this people has been, should I say, brainwashed, has been turned around. But then again, I'll come to a German experience, and it's very difficult for me as a German to compare one fascist dictatorship to another evil regime. But the German history shows that people can change. People can change, and that is a good example. That is maybe a message of hope, but it needs a concerted effort. It needs re-education. It needs the support of the Western world. One last word, because we're here at the Delphi forum, and we had where the debate will go and where Greece stands. I listened very carefully to the speech of the president, Katarina Sakellaropoulou, and she said Europe is a place of dialogue and is a place of cooperation. So I would argue that in the future, after the horrors of the war are done and the Ukraine is liberated, we will have to come to some sort of an arrangement also with Russia.
Thank you, Ronald. Excellent remarks. My final note, I started with history, I will finish with history. I remember my discussion with Francis Fukuyama in 2014. I asked him, Francis, how many of your chapters of the book would you revise? He told me, Sotiris, give me a break. I would rewrite the whole book. The good thing with democracies is that we learn from our mistakes, and that was a mistake. So as Ronald told us, referring also to Sakellaropoulou, the president of the Hellenic Republic, in order for Europe to continue providing the diner and not allowing a member of the European family to become dinner, we need to learn from our mistakes. Thank you all so much.